The engine noise cut out when I turned off the key, leaving just the ticking of cooling metal and Kilo's heavy breathing beside me. 3 hours of highway driving to get away from everything, and my shoulders still held the tension I'd been carrying since I left the apartment that morning. The silence felt good though. Real good. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, working the kinks out of my back while I looked around the trailhead. Empty parking area, just rutted dirt and a wooden sign pointing toward the backcountry trails. Perfect. The last thing I wanted was to run into weekend warriors with their loud voices and expensive gear they didn't know how to use. Kilo jumped down from the passenger seat and immediately started sniffing around the truck's wheels, his tail wagging as he picked up whatever scents other dogs had left behind. His bushy coat caught the afternoon breeze, and I could see the excitement building in his movements. He knew we were heading into the woods. I pulled my pack from the truck bed and started checking my gear one more time. Old habits from 10 years of military service. Always verify your equipment before you need it. The rifle went into its sling across my back. The pistol stayed holstered at my hip, and I secured the bow case to the side of my pack. Probably overkill for a camping trip, but I'd learned long ago that being prepared beat being sorry. The trail started as a narrow dirt path that disappeared into dense pine trees. I checked the map one more time, memorizing the route to the backcountry camping area I'd marked. 3 hours of hiking through rough terrain, but it would put me far enough from the road that I wouldn't hear any traffic noise. Just me, Kilo, and whatever peace I could find out there. "Come on, boy," I called to Kilo, who was still investigating something interesting near a trail marker post. He trotted over and fell into step beside me as we entered the forest. The first hour took us steadily uphill through thick stands of pine and aspen. My boots gripped well on the rocky trail, and my breathing stayed steady even with the climb. Felt good to be moving with a purpose again, using my body for something other than sitting behind a desk or dealing with crowds in the city. Kilo ran ahead and back, checking out interesting smells and chasing the occasional squirrel, but always circling back to make sure I was still behind him. We stopped twice for water breaks, and I watched Kilo lap from his portable bowl, while I looked at the area around us. The trees grew thicker as we climbed higher, blocking out most of the sky and making a green roof overhead. Wildlife signs were everywhere, deer tracks in the mud, claw marks on tree bark, bird calls bouncing through the branches. This was what I'd been missing during all those years of deployment and city living. By the time we reached the area I'd marked on my map, the afternoon had moved along a lot. I found a natural clearing about 50 yards from a small creek that bubbled over smooth rocks. The space was large enough for my tent with room to build a proper fire ring, and the creek would give us all the water we needed. I dropped my pack and started setting up camp while Kilo explored the edge of the clearing. He moved in wide circles, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to check something that caught his attention. His behavior seemed normal, alert, curious, energetic, just the way he always acted in new territory. The tent went up quickly, and I built a fire ring using stones from the creek bed. Gathered enough dead wood to last through the evening, then set up my cooking area downwind from where I'd be sleeping. Basic field craft, but it had kept me alive in places where mistakes got you killed. Kilo came back from his exploration and settled down near the fire ring while I prepared dinner. Nothing fancy, just freeze-dried camping food that I heated over my portable stove. The sun had started going down behind the mountains. The temperature would drop once darkness fell, but the fire would keep us warm. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet sounds of the forest around us. Water moving over rocks in the creek, wind rustling through the pine branches, the occasional bird call in the distance. No car engines, no sirens, no voices except my own when I talked to Kilo. This was exactly what I'd been looking for. The feeling started as we finished dinner and I was cleaning my cooking gear. Nothing I could put my finger on exactly, just a sense that something had changed in the woods around us. The bird calls had stopped, and even the sound of wind in the trees seemed muted. Kilo noticed it too. He raised his head from where he'd been lying and looked toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. I found myself looking at the forest edge automatically, letting my eyes move from left to right in a pattern I'd learned during countless patrols, looking for anything that didn't belong, movement where there should be stillness, shapes that didn't match the natural lines of trees and bushes, any sign that we weren't alone out here. Nothing. Just dark spaces between the tree trunks and the normal shadows you'd expect to see in dense forest. I shook my head and went back to cleaning my gear. Years of combat deployment had left me with reflexes that sometimes fired when they didn't need to. Better to be alert than careless, but I didn't need to jump at every strange feeling in the woods. The sun disappeared completely behind the mountain ridges, and darkness settled over our campsite. I built up the fire and settled back against a fallen log to enjoy the warmth and light. Kilo curled up beside me, his thick coat making him comfortable even as the temperature dropped. Stars began appearing overhead, brighter than anything I could see from the city. I stayed up later than I'd planned, feeding wood to the fire and just enjoying the quiet. This was the first real peace I'd felt in months. No deadlines, no responsibilities, no one expecting anything from me except Kilo, and he was happy as long as we were together. Maybe I'd extend the trip an extra day or two if the weather held. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag around midnight, Kilo settled down just outside the tent entrance like he always did. I'd trained him years ago to position himself where he could watch for any threats while I slept. Old habits from when we both had jobs that required constant vigilance. Sleep came easily in the cool mountain air, but something pulled me back to consciousness around 2 a.m. A sound, maybe, or just that instinct that had kept me alive in dangerous places. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening to the darkness outside the tent. Soft rustling noises came from somewhere near the edge of the clearing. Could be a deer or elk moving through the bushes. But the sound seemed too deliberate, too careful, like something was trying not to make noise but not quite succeeding. I rolled over quietly and looked toward the tent entrance where Kilo should be lying. His bulk was visible in the dim light from the dying fire, but he wasn't moving. No raised head, no alert posture, no sign that he'd heard anything unusual. That struck me as odd. Kilo always reacted to strange sounds, especially at night. The rustling continued for several more minutes before fading away. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent entrance as quietly as possible. Kilo raised his head when I emerged but didn't get up or show any signs of concern. Just watched me with calm eyes as I swept the flashlight beam across the tree line. Nothing moved in the circle of light. The forest looked exactly the same as it had when we'd gone to sleep. Dark trees, thick bushes, normal shadows between the trunks. I stood there for a few more minutes, listening to the silence, but whatever had made the sounds was gone. Just animals, boy, I whispered to Kilo as I crawled back into the tent. He settled his head back down on his paws and went back to sleep. I woke up with the sun and got out of my tent feeling good after the weird noise in the night. Kilo was already up and sniffing around the edges of our spot, following some smell that got his attention. I started the coffee and thought about what to do today while the morning got warmer. That's when I noticed the prints. They were near the creek, maybe 30 feet from where I'd put up the tent. Small marks in the soft mud at the water's edge, clear enough that I could see details. Roughly the size and shape of human footprints, but smaller. Like a child's feet, except the proportions were weird. Too narrow in the heel, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. I bent down next to the prints and looked at them more carefully. How deep they were showed whatever made them was light, probably no more than 60 or 70 pounds. But the steps were strange, shorter than a human would take, with an odd spacing that didn't match normal walking. More prints led away from the creek and went around the edge of our spot. I followed the trail, finding marks in patches of soft ground and pushed aside plants where something had moved through the bushes. The path made a complete loop around our campsite before disappearing into the rocky area beyond the trees. Whatever had visited us during the night had taken its time checking out our camp. The prints showed it had come from multiple angles, always staying just outside the firelight, watching us while we slept. This made my skin crawl, but I tried to think about it calmly. Could be some kind of primate, maybe. Bears left tracks that sometimes looked human-like, but these were too small and the wrong shape. Local wildlife I wasn't familiar with, probably. Nothing threatening about it, just curiosity from whatever lived in these mountains. I called Kilo over to look at the prints, expecting him to show interest in the smell. He sniffed at the tracks briefly, but didn't really react. No excitement, no alertness, no sign that he thought anything was unusual about the smell. That seemed odd for a dog with hunting instincts, but maybe the smell was too old or hidden by other forest scents. The rest of the morning passed normally. I made breakfast, checked my gear, and planned to go fishing at the creek later in the day. The strange prints bugged me, but not enough to pack up and leave. I'd come here to be alone and wasn't about to let some nighttime animal chase me back to the city. Besides, I'd dealt with worse things than curious forest creatures during my years in the military. Whatever had left those tracks would probably avoid our camp now that it knew we were here. Most wild animals wanted nothing to do with humans once they knew we might be dangerous. I spent the rest of the morning checking out the area around our campsite, getting to know the land and looking for good fishing spots along the creek. Kilo came with me, but he seemed less energetic than usual. He walked beside me instead of running ahead, and he didn't show his normal interest in the wildlife signs we found. Maybe the elevation was affecting him, or maybe he was just tired from the long hike yesterday. Nothing to worry about. We'd both get used to the mountain environment in a day or two. I crouched down next to the clearest print and pulled out my knife to measure the dimensions. About 7 inches long, maybe 3.5 wide at the widest point. The shape bothered me more than the size. Human feet didn't taper like that toward the heel, and those marks at the front definitely looked like claws. Deep enough gouges that whatever made them had serious grip strength. The mud had dried overnight, preserving every detail. I took photos with my phone, though I wasn't sure who I'd show them to. David would probably laugh and suggest I'd found bear tracks, but I'd seen plenty of bear sign during my years outdoors. This wasn't that. I followed the trail again, moving more slowly this time and checking for any details I'd missed in my first inspection. Prints near my pack, prints by the fire ring, prints positioned where someone could have watched me sleep. The thought made my jaw tighten, but I pushed down the worry and focused on gathering information. 20 feet from the tent, I found a spot where the grass was flattened in a rough circle. Something had crouched here for an extended period, probably watching me through the tent wall. The depression was small enough that whatever made it couldn't have weighed much, but the way the vegetation was pressed down suggested it had stayed in position for a long time. "Kilo, come here," I called, wanting him to check the scent at this spot. He walked over without much enthusiasm and sniffed half-heartedly at the flattened grass. No reaction at all. No raised hackles, no alert posture, nothing. Just a brief nose-to-ground contact before he lost interest and walked away. That wasn't normal behavior for him. Kilo had hunting instincts bred into him, and strange scents usually got his full attention. I watched him as he headed back toward the creek. His walking seemed fine, no limping or signs of injury. Maybe the elevation was affecting him more than I'd thought. Dogs could get altitude sickness too, though 7,000 feet wasn't extreme. Still, it might explain his lack of energy. Common sense told me I should pack up and head back to the truck. Unknown wildlife behavior, strange tracks, and a dog that wasn't acting like himself added up to a situation I didn't fully understand. Incomplete information was dangerous, but I wasn't ready to give up on something I couldn't identify. I'd come here for peace and quiet, and I wasn't about to let some night visitor chase me back to civilization without even seeing what I was dealing with. I spent another hour examining the tracks before the morning sun made the mud too hard to read. Whatever had visited us was gone now, probably sleeping somewhere in the thick forest during daylight hours. Most predators avoided humans when they could. The fishing gear I'd brought seemed like a good way to pass the day and keep my mind busy. I set up my rod near a deep pool about 100 yards downstream from our campsite, where the water was slow enough for fish. Kilo came with me but lay down in the shade instead of exploring the creek bank like he normally would. I kept glancing over at him while I worked my lure through the water, checking for any changes in his behavior. He seemed alert enough, just less active than usual. His breathing looked normal, and he responded when I talked to him. The fishing turned out better than expected. I caught 3 decent-sized trout in the first 2 hours, enough for dinner tonight and breakfast tomorrow if I decided to stay another day. Casting and reeling in helped calm me down, and the clear mountain air felt good in my lungs. I cleaned the fish at the creek's edge, being careful to bury the scraps well away from our campsite. Bears and other scavengers would smell the remains for miles, and I didn't need to add more complications to whatever was already going on in these woods. The afternoon passed quietly as I explored the area around our camp, getting to know the area and looking for signs of whatever had made those tracks. I found a few more prints near the creek, but they were older and less clear than the ones from last night. The trail disappeared completely when it reached the rocky slopes above the tree line. Kilo followed me during the exploration, but he stayed close instead of ranging ahead like he usually did. No sudden alerts, no pointing at interesting scents, none of the energy I expected from him in new territory. His weird behavior worried me more than the mysterious tracks. By late afternoon, I'd made my decision to stay another night. Whatever was out there hadn't shown any aggressive behavior, just curiosity. My spot was good, with clear views in all directions and the creek on one side. I had 3 loaded weapons and enough ammunition for anything smaller than a grizzly bear. I prepared dinner early, wanting to have everything put away before darkness fell. The trout cooked up perfectly over my portable stove, and I shared some of the flaked meat with Kilo. He ate without his usual enthusiasm, but at least he was eating. The sun dropped behind the mountain peaks around 7:30, and I built up the fire to provide both light and warmth. I put my rifle within easy reach and made sure the safety was off. Always be ready for trouble. Kilo settled into his usual spot near the tent entrance, but something felt different about how he was sitting. Less alert, more passive than I'd ever seen him. I reached over and scratched behind his ears, checking for any signs of illness or injury. His nose felt cool and moist, his breathing steady. Maybe he was just tired from the long hike yesterday. The first hour after sunset passed normally. I fed wood to the fire and listened to the natural sounds of the forest settling into nighttime patterns. Water flowing over rocks, wind moving through pine branches, the occasional call of a night bird. Nothing scary about any of it. The change began around 9 o'clock, so slowly that I almost missed it. The background noise of the forest started to fade until the only sounds were the crackling of my fire and the movement of water in the creek. No more bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the bushes. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I set down the stick I'd been whittling and reached for my rifle, clicking off the safety in one smooth motion. I trusted my gut when something felt wrong, even if I couldn't spot the specific threat. Kilo raised his head but showed no signs of alertness. His ears didn't prick forward, his body language didn't change. He just looked around with what seemed like mild curiosity before settling back down. That reaction, or lack of reaction, sent a chill up my spine. The whispers started around midnight. At first, I thought it might be wind through the trees making sounds that sounded like voices. But as I listened more carefully, the pattern became clear, coming from different directions around the campsite. Low, hissing sounds that almost sounded like words but made no sense. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. The whispers stopped immediately, but I could hear movement in the brush, soft rustling sounds as something, or several things, changed position in the darkness beyond my light. "I know you're out there," I called into the forest. "Show yourselves." Silence. Then, after a few seconds, the whispers resumed. Closer this time, maybe 30 feet from where I stood. The sounds were definitely not wind or natural forest noise. They had rhythm, cadence, like a conversation in a language I'd never heard before. I aimed the flashlight toward the source of the voices, but they went quiet again the moment the light passed over their location. This pattern continued for several minutes. Whispers from the darkness, silence when I tried to light up the source, movement in the bushes as they moved around. I started breathing faster, but I tried to stay calm and think clearly. Someone was out there, moving together, smart enough to hide from my light. Whatever I was dealing with, it was smart enough to learn from what I was doing and change its behavior. "Last warning," I shouted. "Identify yourselves, or I'm treating you as a threat." The response was immediate and unmistakable. Low chatter from at least 3 different directions. Definitely not human voices, but organized enough to be communication. The sounds moved in a rough circle around my campsite, staying just outside the range of my flashlight. I raised the rifle and aimed toward the loudest source of chatter. My finger found the trigger, and I mentally calculated the distance and trajectory. Center mass on whatever was making those sounds. But as I prepared to fire, the chatter stopped. Complete silence from the forest, as if whatever was out there had sensed my intention and decided to withdraw. I held my position for another minute, rifle ready, but no further sounds came from the darkness. Finally, I fired a single shot into the air. The muzzle flash lit up the forest for a split second, and the crack of the rifle carried off the mountain slopes. I worked the bolt and chambered another round, waiting for any reaction. Nothing. The forest had gone completely silent, not even the normal sounds of insects or small animals. I kept the rifle ready and walked slowly around the perimeter of my campsite, flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the tree line. Near the spot where I'd heard the loudest chatter, I found fresh impressions in the soft ground. The same narrow footprints I'd discovered that morning, but these were deeper and more clearly defined. Whatever had made them had been crouched in this exact location, close enough that I could have hit it with a thrown rock. Disturbed vegetation showed where something had moved quickly away from the area after my warning shot. Broken twigs, displaced leaves, a clear path leading back into the dense forest. I followed the trail for about 20 feet before losing it in the rocky terrain. More prints circled the entire campsite, some within 15 feet of where I'd been sitting by the fire. The realization that I'd been surrounded without knowing it made my hands shake slightly as I looked at the tracks. Professional soldiers had tried to get this close to me during combat, and most of them had ended up dead. I spent the rest of the night sitting with my back against a large rock, rifle across my knees and flashlight ready. Whatever was out there seemed to understand firearms well enough to retreat when threatened, but I wasn't taking any chances. Kilo slept through the entire incident. Even the rifle shot hadn't woken him. I woke up stiff and sore from spending the night propped against that rock, rifle balanced across my knees. The morning air felt cold against my face, and my back ached from the awkward position I'd maintained for hours. Every shadow between the trees looked suspicious after what I'd heard in the darkness. Kilo was still asleep near the tent entrance, curled up in the same spot where he'd been when the whispers started. I studied his breathing pattern, watching for any changes from yesterday. Still steady and normal, but he hadn't moved once during the night. I stood up slowly, working the kinks out of my joints while I looked around the tree line. Daylight made everything look ordinary again, just pine trees and bushes, nothing threatening about any of it. But those fresh tracks I'd found last night proved something had been out there, coordinated and intelligent enough to surround my position without me knowing. My first instinct was to pack up and get the hell out of these mountains. 3 nights of strange incidents, tracks that didn't match any wildlife I knew, and now organized harassment from multiple sources. Any reasonable person would call it quits and head back to civilization. But 10 years of military service had burned certain principles into my brain, and one of them was never retreat from an unknown enemy without understanding what you're facing. Running away blind meant you'd never know if the threat was following you, never learn its capabilities or weaknesses. That kind of ignorance got people killed. I made coffee and sat down to think through my options. Whatever was out there had shown intelligence and coordination, but it had also backed off when I demonstrated superior firepower. The whispers had stopped the moment I'd raised my rifle, and the warning shot had cleared the area completely. That suggested these things understood cause and effect well enough to recognize a serious threat. The logical choice was to stay one more night, but this time I'd be ready for them. No more sitting by the fire like an easy target. If these things wanted to play games in the dark, I'd make sure the rules favored me. I spent the morning setting up a proper defensive perimeter around the campsite. Fallen branches became early warning obstacles, positioned where anything approaching would have to move them or go around. I collected rocks and metal camping gear to create noise makers at key points along likely approach routes. Basic field fortification, nothing fancy, but it would give me advance notice of any movement toward my position. Kilo watched me work, but showed no interest in helping or investigating what I was doing. He stayed in one spot most of the morning, occasionally moving but never getting up to explore like he normally would. I checked on him periodically, looking for signs of illness or injury, but his vitals seemed fine. Just that same lethargy I'd noticed yesterday, only worse. "Come on, boy," I said, trying to get him moving. "Let's check the perimeter." He looked at me with those blue eyes but didn't get up, just laid his head back down on his paws and went back to resting. That wasn't normal behavior for a husky, especially one who'd been cooped up in a tent all night. These dogs were bred for endurance and energy, not lying around all day. The afternoon dragged by while I finished my preparations. I put my rifle where I could shoot at anyone coming toward camp, loaded extra magazines for the pistol, and got my bow ready to use. I had 3 different weapons, enough bullets for a small war, and good spots to shoot from that would give me the upper hand. By late afternoon, I turned our peaceful campsite into a fighting position. Anyone coming close would run into noisemakers, obstacles, and weapons pointed their way. Probably too much for whatever lived in these mountains, but I'd rather go overboard than end up dead. I ate dinner early and tied down everything that could make noise or let someone sneak up on me. I kept the fire small, just enough to stay warm without making me an easy target. As the sun went down behind the mountains, I sat with the rifle on my knees and my night vision scope close by. The weird stuff started earlier this time, right when it got dark. No slow buildup like before. Whatever was out there seemed eager to start messing with me. I heard soft rustling from different directions, but whenever I tried to find what was making the noise, it moved before I could spot it. I put the night vision scope on my rifle and started looking around the forest carefully. The green view showed things I couldn't see normally, and that's when I first clearly saw what had been following us. Small, Dark shapes moved between the trees about 50 yards away. They walked on two legs but weren't human, with body shapes matching the footprints I'd been finding. They darted from tree to tree in patterns that made me think they were working together and planning something. I counted at least 4 of them, maybe more. They seemed to be checking out my defenses, taking turns coming closer to look at the obstacles I'd set up. One of them came within 30 feet before running back into the thick forest. Through the scope, I could see them pointing at me and making hand signals that looked like sign language. This wasn't random animal behavior. They were smart. They were talking about what to do next based on what they saw. I tried to get a better look at what they were, but they moved too fast and stayed too far away to see clearly. They looked roughly the size of kids, but wrong somehow, with arms and legs that bent in ways that didn't look right. When I shined my flashlight at them, they disappeared instantly, not running away like scared animals, but vanishing like they were never there. The night vision showed empty forest where seconds before I'd been watching several figures. This kept happening for hours. Movement in the scope, them working together, then instantly gone when I tried to light them up with the flashlight. They were figuring out my gear and tactics, changing how they acted to avoid being seen. Around midnight, my noisemakers started going off. Metal clanging from 3 different directions as something set off the alarms I'd put up. But when I pointed the scope toward the sounds, I found nothing. Whatever triggered the alarms was already gone, moved to a new spot before I could do anything. The stress was getting to me. These things were showing they could come close whenever they wanted, set off my alarms, and get away before I could fight back. They were testing me, learning what I could do, and staying just far enough away that I couldn't effectively fight back. I stayed in position all night, keeping my rifle ready and looking around constantly. The harassment kept up until just before dawn, when the forest finally went quiet. I was out of adrenaline by then, and my hands shook a little as I lowered the rifle. As soon as it was light enough to see, I started checking around the campsite for signs of what happened during the night. What I found scared me badly. Fresh. I spent the entire day questioning every decision that had brought me to this point. 4 nights in these mountains, 3 nights of escalating harassment, and I was still here. The smart play had been obvious after the first incident. Pack up and leave. Now I was committed to something I didn't fully understand, facing an enemy I couldn't identify with tactics that seemed designed more for psychological warfare than direct confrontation. The fresh tracks I'd found that morning told the same story as before. Multiple visitors, coordinated movement, deliberate positioning around my campsite. But the impressions were deeper this time, clearer, as if whatever made them had stopped bothering to move carefully. The change felt significant, though I couldn't determine what it meant. Kilo had barely moved all day. He'd managed to drink water when I brought it directly to him, but he ignored the food I offered and showed no interest in exploring the area. His eyes looked dull, unfocused, like he was seeing something I couldn't. I'd checked his breathing and temperature multiple times, finding nothing obviously wrong, but his behavior had changed so far from normal that I was starting to worry about serious illness. "Come on, boy," I'd said during one of my attempts to get him moving. "Just walk with me to the creek." He'd looked at me without recognition, those blue eyes staring through me as if I wasn't there. No response to his name, no tail wagging, none of the eager energy that defined his personality. Whatever was affecting him was getting worse. I'd spent hours making my defensive position stronger, adding more noisemakers and moving obstacles to create better shooting angles. My rifle had a full magazine, pistol was loaded and ready, bow was strung with my sharpest broadheads. 3 different weapons, each ready for different distances and targets. If something wanted to test me tonight, I was ready to show what I could do. The sun went behind the mountain peaks just after 7:30, and I took my position with my back against the large rock that had worked as cover the night before. The night vision scope was on my rifle. extra magazines close by, flashlight easy to reach. Everything set up to give me the best chance with whatever was coming. I didn't have to wait long. The laughter started before the last daylight had completely faded from the sky. High-pitched, childlike giggles that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not the coordinated whispers of the previous nights, but something more immediate and personal. The sound made my skin crawl and triggered all my combat training from my 10 years in the military. I raised the rifle and looked through the scope, trying to find where the laughter was coming from. The green-tinted view showed movement between the trees, but nothing I could target properly. Shapes that moved from cover to cover, always staying just outside the range where I could get a clear shot. The giggles got louder, bouncing off the mountain slopes until it sounded like a playground full of children hidden in the darkness. But there was something wrong with the sound, something fake about the way it carried through the forest, like someone trying to copy laughter without understanding what made it real. Through the scope, I caught glimpses of movement that didn't match anything I'd seen before. Quick, jerky motions that seemed smart but not human-like. Whatever was out there moved like it was learning how to use its body, practicing movements that should have been natural. Then I saw the eyes, 2 points of red light, glowing like hot coals in the darkness, about 50 yards away. They stayed perfectly still between 2 pine trees, while everything else moved around them. No reflection from my equipment, no outside light source that could explain the glow. Just 2 red dots staring directly at my position. I centered the crosshairs on the space between those eyes and held my breath, finger finding the trigger. The range was well within what I could hit, an easy shot even in low light. But as I started to press the trigger, the eyes vanished, not moving away, not ducking behind cover. Simply gone, as if they'd never been there. The laughter started again immediately, closer this time and definitely mocking. Whatever had those eyes understood exactly what I'd been trying to do, and it found my failure funny. The sound moved in a rough circle around my position, sometimes coming from directly behind my tent, other times from the creek bank 30 feet to my left. I turned the rifle toward each new source of laughter, trying to line up a shot before the sound moved again. But whatever was making the noise was too fast, too random. By the time I could aim, the laughter had moved to a completely different spot. The red eyes appeared again, this time much closer, maybe 30 feet away, between 2 thick tree trunks where the bushes would make it hard to see. I swung the rifle toward them and fired right away. The flash lit up the forest for a split second, and the crack of the rifle bounced off the mountain slopes. I worked the bolt and loaded another round, keeping the scope aimed at where the eyes had been. Nothing there except empty forest and the smell of gunpowder. Laughter burst out from directly behind me, so close I could feel it like breath on my neck. I spun around, rifle ready, but found only darkness beyond my campfire. The sound moved away quickly, fading before coming back from a completely different direction. This was mind games, pure and simple. Whatever was out there had studied my reactions and equipment well enough to stay just outside my range while showing complete control over the situation. It could appear anywhere, disappear when it wanted, and attack from multiple directions without putting itself at risk. The eyes appeared for a third time, on a fallen log about 40 feet away. This time I could make out more details in the scope. A dark shape crouched behind the glowing points, roughly the size shown by the tracks I'd been finding. Too small to be human, too large to be a typical forest animal. I aimed carefully, adjusting for the slight downward angle and the distance. My breathing steadied as I lined up the shot like I'd learned during my military training. Perfect aim, good trigger control, everything set for a clean kill shot. The rifle kicked against my shoulder and the second bullet flew toward its target. But once again, the eyes vanished before the round could reach them. Not fast enough for me to track with my scope, not following any pattern I could guess. just there 1 second, gone the next. The mocking laughter returned immediately, coming from multiple directions at once, as if whatever was out there had multiplied. The sound bounced off trees and rocks, creating extra noises that made it impossible to tell how many there were. Could be one creature moving super fast, could be dozens working together. I fired a third shot at the laughter, aiming toward the loudest source, even though I couldn't see a target. The bullet disappeared into the darkness, followed by sudden silence. For a few seconds, the forest went completely quiet. Then the laughter started again, quieter but longer. It continued for hours, sometimes fading to barely audible giggles, other times building to shrieks that hurt my ears. The pattern was random enough that I couldn't predict when the next outburst would come, keeping me constantly alert and draining my energy. Every shadow became a potential threat. Every sound made me swing the rifle toward a new target. The night vision scope showed me empty forest again and again, but I knew something was out there watching my every move. The mental pressure was more effective than any direct attack could have been. Around midnight, the laughter stopped coming from the forest and started coming from inside my campsite. First from near my tent, then from the fire ring, then from the spot where Kilo lay motionless. But when I aimed the scope toward each location, I found nothing except my own gear and the sleeping dog who hadn't reacted to any of the night's noises. Realizing that whatever was harassing me could move through my defenses at will made my hands shake as I gripped the rifle. All my preparations, all my tactical advantages, meant nothing against something that could appear and disappear without following any rules I understood. I spent the rest of the night switching between my 3 weapons, checking angles that should have given me clear shots at any approaching threat. But the laughter continued to come from places where my scope showed empty space, mocking every attempt I made to fight back. The harassment continued until the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the trees. Only then did the laughter finally fade, leaving me alone with the natural sounds of morning birds and moving water. I'd used most of my ammunition and all of my energy, along with any idea that I could fight whatever lived in these mountains. As full daylight returned to the forest, I lowered my rifle and tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. 4 nights of increasing contact with something that showed intelligence, coordination, and abilities I couldn't explain. Something that had been studying me, learning my weaknesses, and gradually increasing the pressure until I was barely holding it together. I looked over at Kilo, still lying in the same spot where he'd settled yesterday evening. He hadn't moved once during the entire night of gunfire and harassment, hadn't even raised his head when the laughter had come from right beside him. Whatever was happening in these mountains, my dog was somehow part of it now. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I started breaking down camp. 4 nights of harassment had pushed me past my limit, and the only rational response was to get out of these mountains as fast as possible. I went through my packing routine like a robot, checking and securing each item the way I always did after camping trips. The tent folded into its bag without any trouble. Sleeping bag rolled tight and clipped to my pack frame. Cooking gear stacked together and wrapped in a clean towel to keep quiet during the hike out. I moved quickly, wanting to put distance between myself and whatever had been following me through the darkness. I took down my defensive setup next, collecting the noisemakers and obstacles I'd put around the campsite. The metal camping gear made noise as I stuffed it into my pack, but the sound felt reassuring in daylight. Just normal stuff making normal noise, not the impossible disappearing acts I'd seen through my night vision scope. When I reached for my bow case, I automatically checked the arrow quiver attached to its side. I always kept an exact count of my equipment. The quiver should have had 12 arrows, each one picked for different hunting situations. I counted 11. The missing arrow wasn't one of my practice tips or old broadheads that might have fallen out during transport. One of my best hunting arrows was gone, a carbon shaft with a razor-sharp mechanical broadhead that I'd paid good money for, the kind of arrow made to bring down large game with one good shot. I looked around where I'd been sleeping, thinking it might have fallen out during the night. Nothing in the grass near my tent, nothing by the rock where I'd kept watch with my rifle. The arrow was just gone, taken while I'd been awake and armed and looking for any sign of movement. I suddenly understood. Whatever had been messing with me had gotten through my defenses, come close enough to reach me, and taken equipment from my gear. While I'd been looking through the forest with my scope, while I'd been shooting at red eyes and mysterious laughter, something had been close enough to touch me. I made myself finish packing, checking every piece of equipment twice to make sure nothing else was missing. My rifle went into its case with a full magazine, ready to use right away. Pistol stayed in its holster on my belt, loaded and easy to reach. If whatever took my arrow tried anything during my hike out, I'd be ready. "Kilo," I called, shouldering my pack and adjusting the straps for the 3-hour trek back to the trailhead. "Come on, boy, time to go." No response from the area where he'd been lying since yesterday evening. I looked over at his usual spot near the tent, expecting to see him stretched out in his typical sleeping position. He was there, but something about how he was sitting seemed wrong. Instead of the relaxed sprawl of a resting dog, he sat upright with perfect posture, completely still. "Kilo, let's move." I kept my voice firm, using the command tone that had always gotten his immediate attention. "Pack up time." He turned his head toward me, and that's when I saw his eyes. Still the same bright blue color I'd known for 5 years, but the expression behind them had changed completely. No recognition of his name, no eager anticipation of another adventure. Just blank, vacant staring, like he was looking through me at something only he could see. I approached cautiously, checking his body language for signs of illness or injury that might explain the strange behavior. His breathing looked normal, no obvious signs of distress or pain. But the way he held himself was all wrong. Too rigid, too controlled, like someone wearing an unfamiliar costume and trying not to break character. "What's wrong with you, boy?" I crouched down a few feet away, extending one hand for him to smell. Standard procedure for approaching a potentially sick or injured animal. "You feeling okay?" Kilo's head tilted at an unnatural angle, joints moving in jerky, mechanical ways. He moved in a strange stop-and-start pattern that didn't look right. No dog moved like that, and huskies usually move smoothly. I pulled his leash from my pack, planning to secure him for the walk out no matter how he was acting. I'd need to get him to a vet once we got back to town. The important thing was getting both of us away from these mountains. "Come here, Kilo." I held up the familiar red leash, the same one we'd used for hundreds of walks over the past 5 years. "Let's get you home." The sound that came from his throat stopped me cold. Not a bark, not a whine, not any sound I'd ever heard from a dog. A low, guttural noise that came from deep inside him, making my teeth hurt. The sound kept going for several seconds, changing in a way that reminded me of some weird alien talk. Kilo's lips pulled back from his teeth, but it wasn't a normal snarl. His mouth opened way too wide, showing more of his gums and teeth than should be possible. The growl had different sounds all at once, like several voices were trying to talk through him at the same time. I took a step back, still holding the leash but not moving closer anymore. This wasn't my dog anymore, wasn't any dog I'd ever seen. Whatever was looking at me through those blue eyes knew exactly what was happening, and it thought my confusion was funny. The weird sounds kept going, sometimes almost sounding like words in a language I didn't know, other times turning into clicking noises like broken machinery. But the pattern made it seem like something was trying to talk using a dog's mouth that wasn't made for speaking. "Kilo," I tried one more time, hoping to reach whatever remained of my companion. "It's me, boy. It's Mike." The thing in Kilo's body moved, still moving in that weird, controlled way. It stood up with the same jerky mechanical motion I'd noticed before, each leg moving on its own instead of how dogs normally move. Then it stepped toward me, and I saw the truth in its eyes. No confusion, no animal instinct, nothing left of the loyal friend who'd shared my tent for 5 years. Just cold, alien intelligence using my dog's body and learning how to control it. My dog was gone. Whatever had been following me through the night had finally gotten what it wanted, taking over the thing I trusted most and turning it into another tool to mess with my head. The creature had been watching Kilo for days, learning how he acted and responded, getting ready for this moment when it could take over completely. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the thing that used to be Kilo while my hands found the pistol at my belt. My training kicked in, and I quickly sized up the situation. This was a dangerous, unknown thing using a look I knew to try to make me drop my guard. The sound it made grew louder, more pushy, like it wanted something from me. It wasn't Kilo's voice anymore, not even close to anything normal. Just alien noise coming from a stolen throat, using the same voice that had once happily greeted me when I came home from work. I had to leave him behind. It hurt badly, but I had no choice. Whatever had taken control of Kilo wasn't something I could fight or fix or talk to. My only option was to walk away from 5 years of loyalty and trust, because the thing looking at me now wasn't capable of either. It hurt to make that choice, but I made it anyway. I turned my back on the thing that looked like Kilo and started walking toward the trail that would take me back to civilization, back to normal life where dogs are just dogs. I put my pack on and made myself take the first step away from what used to be Kilo. My pack felt really heavy. I stepped onto the narrow trail that would take me back to civilization, back to a world where dogs stayed dogs and nothing wore faces that didn't belong to them. My footsteps on packed dirt seemed too loud in the morning quiet. Each step took me further from 5 years of loyalty and companionship, further from the best friend I'd ever had. I felt a pain in my chest with every yard of distance, but I kept moving. Walking away was the right choice, the only choice that made sense. But knowing something was right didn't make it feel any less like betrayal. The trail went upward through thick pine forest, following the same route I'd taken 4 days ago when everything was still normal. Same fallen logs to step over. Same rocky patches where I had to watch my footing. But the forest felt different now, like something was off that hadn't been there before. I felt like I was being watched as I left. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I heard the first howl. The sound came from somewhere behind me, bouncing off the mountain slopes in a way that made it impossible to tell how far away it was. It started like Kilo's voice, that bark he used when he caught an interesting smell or wanted my attention. But something was wrong with the pitch, the rhythm, like someone trying to copy a dog's howl after only hearing a bad recording of one. I stopped walking and listened, hoping I'd imagined it. The howl came again, longer this time, wavering through notes that no dog throat should have been able to make. Too high, then too low, with sounds that made my teeth hurt the same way that alien growling had done back at camp. I grabbed the pistol grip at my belt without thinking, but I didn't pull the weapon out. Whatever was making that sound was still too far away to be in immediate danger, and I needed to keep moving toward the trailhead. The howling continued as I kept hiking, always coming from behind me but never getting closer. It followed me through the forest, matching my pace but staying the same distance away. Sometimes it sounded almost like Kilo, close enough to make me feel hopeful. Other times it turned into mechanical warbling that belonged in a broken radio rather than a living throat. I made myself keep a steady rhythm, one foot in front of the other, breathing controlled and even. Military training had taught me to ignore distractions during movement, to focus on the mission objectives rather than outside harassment. Get to the truck, load the gear, drive away. Simple tasks that I could complete regardless of what noises followed me through the trees. But this wasn't enemy fire or artillery bombardment. This was something using my dog's voice, calling after me with sounds that grew more desperate and wrong with each repetition. It made every step feel like I was walking through thick mud. My legs moved normally, but it took more effort to keep going with every yard. The terrain started getting steeper as I climbed toward the ridge that separated this drainage from the main valley. My pack straps dug into my shoulders and sweat soaked through my shirt even though the mountain air was cool. The physical effort felt good, gave me something real to focus on instead of the alien howling that kept bouncing around behind me. Halfway up the ridge, the howling changed. Instead of the broken copy of dog sounds, the noise became more complex. Still wrong, still artificial, but with patterns that suggested language. Syllables that almost formed words, rhythm that sounded like conversation. Like something was trying to call my name but couldn't quite remember how human speech was supposed to work. I stopped again, pack heavy on my shoulders, and turned to look back down the trail. Nothing visible through the trees, just thick forest and morning shadows. But the sound continued, coming from somewhere close enough that I should have been able to see what was making it. Whatever was making those noises was staying just out of sight, following me through cover while practicing speech with stolen vocal cords. The thought made my skin crawl. It was learning how to use Kilo's voice, experimenting with sounds and tones like a child playing with a new toy. Each howl was slightly different from the last, as if it was testing which combinations would get the strongest reaction from me. I turned my back on the sound and kept climbing. The ridge was only another 100 yards ahead, and once I got to the top, I'd be able to see the main valley where my truck waited. Just keep moving. Don't think about what's behind you. Focus on getting home. But the howling grew more insistent as I climbed higher, more frequent, more varied, with tones that pulled at something deep in my chest. It knew I was getting farther away, and whatever alien intelligence was using Kilo's body was getting desperate to call me back. By the time I reached the ridge, the sounds had become almost human. Not quite words, but close enough that my brain kept trying to understand them as speech. Sometimes it sounded like my name stretched out over impossible syllables. Other times like begging, like something in pain that needed help. I knew it was manipulation, psychological warfare designed to exploit my emotional attachment to Kilo. But knowing didn't make it easier to ignore. Every fake whimper made me want to turn around, to go back and see if maybe I'd been wrong about what I'd seen. Maybe my dog was hurt and scared and calling for me to come help him. The logical part of my mind completely rejected that possibility. I'd seen what Kilo had become, heard the alien sounds coming from his throat, watched him move with jerky precision that belonged to no living creature. But the emotional part, the part that remembered 5 years of unconditional loyalty and trust, whispered that maybe I was making a terrible mistake. I started down the far side of the ridge, picking my way carefully through loose rocks and steep switchbacks. The howling continued behind me, but fainter now, muffled by the mountain between us. Distance was helping, making the sounds easier to dismiss as wind through trees or noises from some other source. The trail leveled out as I entered the main valley, following a creek that would eventually lead me back to the trailhead. 2 more hours of walking, maybe less if I went faster. I could see my truck by noon, be driving back toward civilization before the afternoon heat made the dirt roads dusty and difficult. That's when the howling stopped. The sudden silence was more worrying than the alien sounds had been. At least when it was making noise, I could track where it roughly was, tell whether it was getting closer or staying the same distance. Now I had no idea where it was or what it might be doing. I kept walking, but every few minutes I found myself looking over my shoulder at the empty trail behind me. Nothing there except forest and rocks and the normal sounds of morning wildlife. But the absence of pursuit felt wrong somehow, like the calm before a storm that would be worse than anything I'd experienced so far. The creek beside the trail grew larger as smaller streams joined it from side valleys. The sound of moving water helped cover my footsteps, but it also made it harder to hear if anything was following me. I found myself stopping often to listen, looking around the tree line for movement that might show I wasn't alone. An hour passed without any sign of the thing that had been calling after me. Then another hour. The forest seemed normal again, with birds and squirrels and the usual small creatures that made noise when humans disturbed their territory. I started to relax, thinking maybe I'd finally gotten far enough away from whatever had taken control of Kilo. By the time I saw the parking area through the trees ahead, my legs felt like rubber, and my shoulders hurt from the pack straps. 3 hours of hiking under emotional stress had used up more energy than a normal day-long trek. But seeing my truck sitting exactly where I'd left it 4 days ago made relief wash over me. I stumbled into the small clearing that served as a trailhead, dropping my pack beside the driver's door and fumbling for my keys. Everything looked normal. Same tire tracks in the dirt, same pine needles on the windshield. No signs that anything had messed with the vehicle while I'd been in the mountains. My hands shook as I unlocked the tailgate and started loading my gear. Pack went in first, followed by my rifle case and bow. Each piece of equipment felt like a return to normal life, to a world where I understood the rules and could predict how things would behave. I slammed the tailgate shut and walked around to the driver's side, keys ready to start the engine and get out of here as fast as the dirt road would allow. The silence in the forest behind me felt heavy, like something huge holding its breath. The engine started on the first try, rumbling to life with a reliability that sounded better than music. I put the truck in gear and started moving toward the main road, gravel crunching under my tires as I sped away from the trailhead. My eyes went to the rearview mirror automatically, checking for other vehicles or obstacles behind me. The small parking area disappeared quickly as I climbed the first hill, trees closing in to block the view of where I'd been. But I kept checking the mirror anyway, looking for something that logic told me couldn't be there. The dirt road went through thick forest for 2 miles before connecting to the paved county highway. I drove faster than was probably safe, taking curves without slowing down and hitting bumps hard enough to make my teeth click together. The truck handled the abuse without complaint, carrying me away from the mountains toward civilization and safety. When I finally reached the paved road, I stopped at the intersection and looked back one more time. Nothing behind me except empty gravel road disappearing into green forest. No sign of pursuit, no indication that anything had followed me down from the high country. But the silence felt wrong. After days of increasing harassment, after hours of alien howling that had tracked me through the forest, the complete absence of contact felt like a held breath before something worse was coming. I turned onto the highway and drove toward town, checking my mirrors every few seconds out of habit and growing paranoia. The further I got from the mountains, the more normal everything seemed. Other vehicles appeared on the road, houses and businesses began showing up along the route. The world I understood was still there, still working according to rules that made sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished back in those mountains, something that wasn't done with me yet, no matter how much distance I put between us. The silence behind me felt like a promise. 3 days of guilt had worn me down to nothing. I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, staring at my phone and trying to convince myself that what I'd done in those mountains was necessary. The logical part of my mind kept repeating the same arguments. That thing hadn't been Kilo anymore. Walking away was the only safe choice. There was nothing I could have done to help him. But logic wasn't helping me sleep at night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blue eyes looking at me with alien intelligence, heard that mechanical clicking sound coming from his throat, watched him move with jerky, unnatural precision like broken machinery. The creature had taken everything that made Kilo my companion and turned it into a weapon designed to hurt me in the deepest way possible. But underneath all the rational explanations, a simpler truth kept eating at me. I'd abandoned my dog. 5 years of loyalty and trust, and when he needed me most, I'd turned my back and walked away. The fact that something else had been controlling his body didn't change the fundamental betrayal of leaving him behind. My apartment felt too quiet without the sound of paws on hardwood floors or the soft huffing noises Kilo made when he settled down for a nap. His food bowls still sat in their usual spot by the kitchen door, water dish half full because I couldn't bring myself to empty it. His favorite tennis ball lay under the coffee table where he'd left it before our camping trip, bright yellow against the dark wood. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found David Rodriguez's number. Dave was the only person I could call for something like this, the only friend who wouldn't ask too many questions or try to talk me out of what needed to be done. 10 years of military service had taught both of us that sometimes you had to go back for your people, no matter how dangerous or pointless it seemed. He answered on the second ring. "Mike, what's up, man? I need your help with something." My voice sounded rough, like I hadn't used it much over the past few days. "It's about Kilo. Your dog? What's wrong?" I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times, trying to find words that would get Dave's help without making me sound completely insane. He got sick on our camping trip. Real sick. I had to leave him up there, and now I need to go back and get him. Silence on the other end of the line. Dave was processing what I told him, trying to read between the lines like we'd both learned to do during deployment. "How sick are we talking? Like, put him down sick." "Yeah." The lie came easier than I'd expected. I couldn't carry him out, and he was suffering. I did what I had to do, but I can't just leave him up there. "Where's up there?" "Colorado wilderness, about 3 hours north of Denver. It's rough country. Gonna need your truck to get close." Another pause. Dave knew I didn't ask for help lightly, especially not for something that would require a full day of driving and hiking. "When do you want to go?" "Tomorrow morning. Early." "All right, I'll pick you up at 6. Bring whatever gear you need for backcountry hiking." Relief flooded through my chest. "Thanks, Dave. I owe you one. Don't worry about it. See you tomorrow." He hung up without asking for more details, which was exactly why I'd called him instead of anyone else. Dave understood that some missions didn't require full briefings, that sometimes you just had to trust your buddies and do what needed to be done. I spent the rest of the day gathering gear for the return trip. My hiking pack still sat by the front door where I'd dropped it 3 days ago, loaded with all the equipment I'd carried out of the mountains. The rifle case leaned against the wall beside it, cleaned and ready. My pistol was in its belt holster, loaded with a full magazine and 1 round chambered. The night passed without sleep. Every time I started to drift off, I heard that broken howling repeating through my dreams, Kilo's voice twisted into something alien and wrong. By 5 in the morning, I was sitting on my front steps with my gear, watching for Dave's headlights to turn onto my street. His truck pulled into my driveway at 6. The diesel engine made a deep rumble. It was a serious off-road truck with big tires and a winch on the front. Dave got out wearing hiking boots, cargo pants, and a worn-out flannel shirt. His face looked weathered. He had a pistol in a shoulder holster under his jacket where he could grab it quickly. "Morning," he said, grabbing my pack and rifle case without being asked. "You look like hell." "Feel worse." I secured my bow case in the back of his truck and climbed into the passenger seat. "Thanks for doing this. Don't mention it. Where are we headed?" I gave him directions to the trailhead while he backed out of my driveway and started driving north. The route would take us through Denver's morning traffic, then up into the mountains on increasingly rough roads. 3 hours of driving, followed by another 3 hours of hiking to reach the campsite where I'd left everything behind. Dave kept the conversation light during the first hour, talking about his job and mutual friends from our old unit, normal topics that didn't require much attention, giving me space to process what we were about to do. He had the radio tuned to classic rock, volume low enough that we could talk, but loud enough to fill the comfortable silences. As we climbed into the foothills west of Denver, the landscape changed from suburban development to scattered ranches and then to thick forest. Pine trees lined both sides of the highway, and the air coming through the vents smelled clean like mountain plants. Under normal circumstances, I would have enjoyed the drive. Today it felt like traveling toward an execution. "So what really happened up there?" Dave asked when we turned onto the dirt road that led to the trailhead. His tone was casual, but I could hear the concern underneath. "And don't give me the same story you told yesterday. I know you, Mike. You don't abandon animals, especially not Kilo." I stared out the passenger window at the forest moving past. Tall pines and aspen groves that looked normal in daylight, showing no signs of the wrongness I'd experienced during 4 nights of harassment. He got sick, started acting strange, like he didn't recognize me anymore. By the 4th day, he wasn't responding to his name or basic commands. Altitude sickness, maybe? Some dogs don't adjust well to elevation changes. Maybe. I let him believe that explanation, even though it didn't come close to describing what I'd actually witnessed. Whatever it was, he wasn't my dog anymore. Something about his behavior just felt wrong. Dave nodded like that made sense, but I could tell he was still processing the gaps in my story. Military training had taught both of us to spot inconsistencies in mission briefings, and my explanation was full of holes big enough to drive a truck through. But he was also smart enough to recognize when a friend wasn't ready to share everything. The dirt road curved higher into the mountains, following a creek through a narrow valley with steep slopes. Dave's truck handled the rough terrain well, bouncing over the worst bumps. We passed a few other vehicles heading down the mountain. "How much further?" Dave asked as we climbed a particularly steep section that required 4-wheel drive. "About another mile to the trailhead, then 3 hours on foot. 3 hours each way, plus time to do whatever we're doing up there. Gonna be a long day." "Yeah." I checked the time on the dashboard clock. 8:30 in the morning, which meant we'd reach the campsite around noon if we kept a steady pace. Plenty of daylight left for the hike back out, assuming we didn't encounter any complications. The trailhead appeared around the next bend, exactly as I remembered it. Small parking area carved out of the forest, big enough for maybe 6 vehicles. A wooden sign marked the beginning of the hiking trail, along with warnings about bear safety and wilderness regulations. Dave parked next to the trail marker and shut off the engine. Silence settled over us as the diesel motor ticked and cooled. Through the windshield, I could see the narrow path disappearing into dense forest, following the same route I'd taken 4 days ago when everything was still normal. The trees looked innocent enough in morning sunlight, just another pretty Colorado wilderness area that attracted hikers and campers from all over the country. "You sure about this?" Dave asked, studying my face for signs of doubt or hesitation. "We could call the Forest Service, have them send a team up to handle the retrieval." "No." The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "This is something I need to do myself." Dave shrugged and opened his door. "All right, your call." We spent 10 minutes getting ready for the hike, checking our stuff and fixing our backpack straps for the 3-hour walk ahead. Dave had his own hiking pack with water, emergency supplies, and extra bullets for the gun under his jacket. I put my pack on and started up the trail, with Dave walking behind me. The usual rhythm of hiking helped calm my nerves as we settled into a steady pace that would take us deep into the backcountry. The forest felt different with another person present. Less scary somehow. more like normal woods instead of the strange landscape I'd seen during my solo camping trip. Bird sounds bounced between the trees, and small animals moved through the bushes when we passed by. "Nice country up here," Dave commented as we crossed a small creek on a fallen log. "Haven't been in the high country for a while." "Yeah, it's pretty." I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, scanning for landmarks that would tell me how much distance we'd covered. "Usually real peaceful." Dave chuckled. "Usually? What happened? Did you run into some unfriendly locals or something?" "Something like that." I didn't elaborate, and he didn't push for details. We climbed steadily through dense forest, following switchbacks that gained elevation while working around steep terrain features. The same route I'd hiked 4 days ago, but in reverse and with company that made everything feel safer. An hour passed without incident, then another hour. Dave kept up a stream of casual conversation, commenting on the scenery and telling stories about other hiking trips he'd taken over the years. His voice helped fill the silence that had felt so threatening during my previous time in these mountains. "You know what this reminds me of?" he said as we approached the ridge that separated this drainage from the main valley. "That training exercise we did in Montana. Remember that? 3 days in the wilderness with minimal gear, trying to avoid the aggressor force." I remember. The exercise had been designed to test our survival skills and ability to operate behind enemy lines. We'd spent most of the time cold, hungry, and paranoid about being captured by the opposing team. This is a lot more comfortable than that was. "Speak for yourself." I had a sleeping bag that time. We made it to the top of the ridge and headed down the other side, going into the area where I'd spent 4 nights being slowly driven crazy by creatures that shouldn't exist. The forest looked exactly the same as it had during my hike out 3 days ago, with no signs of all the harassment I'd been through. But something seemed off about how quiet it was between the trees. Too quiet, like the animals were staying away from this place for reasons they couldn't understand. Dave noticed it too, though he thought it was just normal forest stuff. "Not much bird activity down here," he observed as we descended toward the creek that would lead us to my former campsite. "Probably human scent keeping them away. This trail gets decent traffic during the season." I nodded but didn't answer. The lack of animals around us was bugging me more than it should, triggering the same combat instincts that kept me alive during my time in the military. Every shadow between the trees looked like a possible danger. Every sound of wind through pine needles seemed like movement I needed to check out. Dave either didn't notice how tense I was or didn't say anything about it. He kept his casual pace, sometimes stopping to look at interesting rocks or point out animal tracks in the soft ground by the creek. Normal tourist stuff that helped hide how worried I was getting about what might be ahead. The last hour of hiking went by slowly, each familiar landmark bringing us closer to the campsite where I'd left Kilo behind. The fallen log where I'd rested during my first hike up, the big boulder that marked the halfway point between the ridge and my camping spot, the bend in the creek where I'd caught trout for dinner on my second day. Everything looked normal, just as it should, but the strange feeling was getting stronger, like a bad headache. Something about this place had changed since my last visit, in ways too small to spot but too important to ignore. "How much further?" Dave asked as we rounded another bend in the trail. "Maybe 15 minutes. My mouth felt dry despite the cool mountain air. The campsite's in a clearing just ahead. That's when the smell hit us. It came on the wind from somewhere up ahead, carried downstream along the creek valley, sweet and cloying, and absolutely wrong. The unmistakable scent of death and decay that every veteran recognized instantly. Dave stopped walking and lifted his head, sniffing as he tried to figure out where it was coming from. "Jesus," he muttered, his hand moving automatically toward the pistol under his jacket. How long did you say you left him up there? 3 days. The smell was stronger than it should have been, more concentrated than a single dog's body could produce even in warm weather. My stomach clenched as possibilities ran through my mind, each one worse than the last. Dave's casual attitude disappeared completely. His face changed to the look I remembered from combat zones, alert and ready for trouble. Maybe we should call this in after all. Let the authorities handle whatever's up there. No. I started walking again, forcing myself to move toward the source of that awful smell. We're here now. Might as well finish what we came to do. But as we approached the clearing where I'd spent 4 nights in hell, every instinct I'd developed during 10 years of military service was screaming at me to turn around and get out of these mountains as fast as possible. The smell of death grew stronger with every step. The clearing appeared exactly as I'd left it 3 days ago, except for the horror waiting in its center. My old campsite looked normal at first. The fire ring I'd built from creek stones was still there, filled with cold ashes from my last morning. The flat area where my tent had been showed pressed down grass, but no other signs anyone had been there. The defensive perimeter I'd set up was still partly intact, with fallen branches and rock piles I'd arranged to warn me if anything approached. Dave stopped walking about 20 feet from the clearing's edge, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "Mike, I don't like this." I kept moving forward. My guilt and military training pushed me to face whatever waited ahead. For 3 days, I'd wondered what happened to Kilo, and for 3 nights, I'd barely slept, hearing strange howling. Even though everything told me to stay away, I had to come back. The body lay in the exact center of the clearing. At first, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The shape looked wrong, too flat and spread out to be a sleeping dog. But the gray and white fur was definitely Kilo's, and I could still see his markings even with how bad the body looked. Someone or something had torn him open from throat to tail with surgical precision. I stopped walking and stared. My hands started shaking as I realized how bad the mutilation was. This wasn't done by scavengers or predators. No bear or mountain lion had done this. The cuts were too clean, too careful, made by something that knew anatomy and had taken its time. Kilo's internal organs had been taken out and arranged in a perfect circle around his body. Heart, liver, kidneys, lungs, each organ placed the same distance from the corpse. The arrangement looked planned, showing that whatever did this was smart and had a reason. "Jesus Christ," Dave whispered, moving up beside me. His face had gone pale under his tan, and I could hear his breathing getting faster. What the hell did this? I couldn't answer him. I couldn't speak at all, and I could barely see as I tried to make sense of it all. The friend I'd had for 5 years was now just bloody pieces on the grass. Someone did this on purpose. They wanted to hurt us. Dave pulled out his phone and started dialing. "I'm calling this in. The state police need to see this. Maybe bring in federal investigators. This looks like some kind of ritual killing." "No." I grabbed his wrist and forced the phone down. "Don't call anyone." "Are you out of your mind? Look at this place, Mike. Someone tortured your dog to death and arranged his guts like some kind of satanic altar. We can't just walk away from this." I understood his reaction, but I also knew that no official report could explain what had really happened here. How could I tell investigators about 4 nights of alien harassment, about watching my dog transform into something that spoke in mechanical clicking sounds? How could I describe red eyes that vanished when fired upon, or laughter that came from multiple directions at the same time? "Think about it," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "What are you going to tell them? That something in these mountains killed a dog and arranged its organs in patterns? They'll want to know why we're here, why I left him behind in the first place. You want to try explaining that to a detective?" Dave looked at me for a while, thinking it over. We both knew that getting the police involved would mean answering questions that would get us in trouble. My story about leaving a sick dog behind wouldn't hold up when they looked into it, especially when they found the makeshift barriers I'd set up and the rifle cases we'd brought back. "Fine," he said finally, putting his phone away. "But we're not staying here long. Whatever did this might still be around." I made myself get closer to the body, looking at the scene for details that might explain what happened after I left. The clean cuts looked like they were made by something with hands, not claws. Something smart, not just an animal. But what I found around the outside of the organ circle made me completely freeze up. My missing arrows were stuck in the ground in a star pattern around Kilo's body, making a 5-pointed star with the corpse in the middle. Each arrow had been pushed into the ground hard enough that you couldn't see the arrowheads anymore, just the carbon shafts and fletching sticking out. 12 arrows total, every single one from my quiver, including the hunting arrow that disappeared from my campsite while I was awake and keeping watch. "Those yours?" Dave asked, following my gaze to the arrow pattern. "Yeah." My voice came out as barely a whisper. "They went missing during the nights I was here. I thought maybe I'd miscounted or dropped them somewhere." The realization shocked me. Whatever was messing with me hadn't just taken stuff from my camp. It had been collecting trophies, taking pieces of my gear while I sat just 20 feet away holding a loaded rifle. The creature had been close enough to touch me, close enough to kill me whenever it wanted, but instead, it just took small things and waited. Dave bent down next to one of the arrows and looked at it without touching. These weren't just stuck in the ground randomly. Look at the spacing, the angles. Someone measured this out, made sure everything was perfectly positioned. He was right. The stars were laid out perfectly, each arrow placed at the exact right distance and angle to make perfect points. This kind of planning showed a level of intelligence I'd never seen in the wilderness before. A new thought popped into my head, worse than all the others. It was studying me. What? The thing that did this. It wasn't just trying to scare me away or defend territory. It was learning my habits, my equipment, my weaknesses. I gestured toward the arrow pattern. It knew exactly which arrows I carried, what they looked like, how many I had. It watched me prepare my weapons, counted my ammunition, studied everything I did. Dave stood up slowly, his hand moving back toward his pistol. "Studied you for what purpose?" I don't know. But the answer was there in the arranged organs and ritual arrow placement. Whatever had taken control of Kilo's body had been preparing for something, gathering information for some future encounter. The harassment I'd experienced wasn't random predation. It was reconnaissance. The creature had turned my most trusted companion into a living surveillance device, watching me through Kilo's eyes for days before I'd even realized anything was wrong. Every habit, every tactical decision, every moment of vulnerability had been observed and cataloged by an intelligence wearing my dog's face. "We need to bury him," I said, unable to look at the remains any longer. "I can't leave him like this." Dave nodded and started looking around for digging tools. "There's a folding shovel in my pack. Ground's probably pretty soft near the creek." We spent the next hour digging a grave in the forest soil beside the creek where Kilo used to drink during our camping trips. Neither of us spoke much during the work, focusing on the physical task of moving dirt rather than thinking about what we were burying. The hole had to be deep enough to discourage scavengers, wide enough for our big husky. Gathering the remains was the worst part. I forced myself to collect each piece, each organ from the ritual circle, refusing to let Dave handle the job alone. This was my responsibility, my failure to protect Kilo. The least I could do was ensure he received a proper burial. When everything was finally in the ground and covered with rocks to prevent disturbance, Dave pulled the arrows from their star pattern and handed them to me. The broadheads were undamaged, still sharp enough to bring down large game. I slid them back into my quiver, trying not to think about where they'd been or what they'd been used to mark. "You ready to get out of here?" Dave asked, shouldering his pack. I took one last look around the clearing where I'd spent 4 nights being slowly driven insane. Everything looked normal again, just another pretty camping spot in the Colorado wilderness. No signs remained of the horror that had played out here. No evidence that something alien and intelligent had used this place for purposes I couldn't begin to understand. "Yeah, let's go." The hike back to the trailhead passed in silence. Dave set a fast pace, and I didn't object to leaving the mountains as quickly as possible. 3 hours of steady walking through forest that felt like it was watching us. By the time we reached Dave's truck, the sun was going down behind the mountains. We loaded our gear without talking and started the long drive back to town, first on dirt roads, then highways, and finally into city traffic. Dave kept the radio off during the drive home, giving us both space to think about what we'd seen. But as we got farther away and the mountains disappeared behind us, I started to worry about something new. Somewhere back in those forests, something was still walking around looking exactly like Kilo. The creature had copied my dog perfectly during my final morning at the campsite. It had watched Kilo's behavior for days, learned how he acted, and even got his bark right, enough to trick someone who'd known him for years. Now other campers would go into those mountains, families with children who might meet something that looked like a friendly lost dog. The creature would come to their campsites looking like Kilo, wagging his tail and acting like a harmless pet that got separated from its owner. And by the time they realized something was wrong, it would be too late. I couldn't stop thinking about what might happen to innocent people as I stared out the passenger window while we drove through the dark. Other hikers, other dogs, other companions who trusted completely and deserved better than what happened to Kilo. I couldn't warn them. Couldn't file reports or post warnings that anyone would believe. All I could do was know what was waiting in those mountains and hope that other people would be smarter or else.